Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started today. We have a few more stragglers probably coming in after we get started, but that's okay. Just a real quick update on everything. I know that the earlier email had expressed that we were going to cover the FY16 application. A couple of days after I sent out that email, we got notified that the FDA was going to come in and conduct a drug and alcohol program audit for IDOT. And they selected a handful of recipients to visit and ask a whole bunch of questions and go through a complete program audit of those subrecipient sites. So in light of that upcoming audit, we felt it was a good opportunity to go ahead and use this session to kind of remind everybody what is required in a very general, high-level sense from your drug and alcohol program, drug and alcohol testing program. And then on on Wednesday of next week, we are going to conduct a training in Springfield for the folks who are actually going to be visited by the auditors. We're going to open up that training to a webinar. We're going to broadcast that the same way we're doing now, open that up to a webinar, and allow folks to kind of sit in and listen and watch us go through the actual program questions, the audit review questions rather, and then give an overview of what the overall audit process is and how the FDA conducts that. So if you have specific program application questions, which is what we were going to cover today, please feel free to reach out to me or your DIPIT project manager. We'll be glad to go over those questions with you individually. And if there's something that we feel that the entire field would benefit from, we will put that out to the field as well. On the screen right now, you can see that what I've done is attach the handouts to the control panel. I figured out how to do that earlier today. I think that's kind of cool. I did email the presentation before we got started about 15 minutes ago, but in case you didn't get the email, you have the ability to download the handout or the presentation rather right here from your control panel. And as always, as you can see right above that is the questions box. If you have a question at any point in time, please feel free to enter your question in that box. I'll do my best to answer your question here within this session. If I can't answer it within this session, then I will do my best to research and answer for you and get back to you after today's session. So again, thank you for coming today or for attending today. What we're going to cover, if I can get this to work, what we're going to cover is the drug and alcohol testing program. And again, I want to reiterate that this is a very high-level, quick review of what the requirements of a testing program are. When it comes to the area of FDA compliance, there are a lot of rules and regulations that are open to some interpretation or that can be decided on a local level. There are some compliance requirements in the financial section that are a little bit more prescribed. But in general, as long as you tell the FDA what it is that you're doing and then you can prove that you're doing it, they're pretty much okay with that. When it comes to drug and alcohol testing, however, they take the complete opposite approach. They are very, very rigid and very prescribed about how they want the drug and alcohol testing program to operate in the transportation industry. And we're going to give a little bit of background for how we came to be so prescribed and so rigid with it. We want to make sure that at a minimum, everybody on the call today gets a general understanding of what the expectation is. We won't necessarily dive into great detail about the individual requirements, but we're going to give you as much background information as we can, and we're going to give you as high a level overview of what the expectations are as possible. On the training that happens on Wednesday, we're going to get into a lot more depth with what the actual requirements are. So today what we're going to cover, I'm going to cover background a little bit, tell you how and why the FDA is so restricted in their drug and alcohol testing program, or so controlling, for lack of a better term. We're going to give some basic definitions of some of the acronyms we're going to talk about today, and then you're going to hear a lot more about on Wednesday. We're going to talk about what the grantee responsibility is. What exactly do grant recipients have to be responsible for? What do operators have to be responsible for? How do the partnerships work and how do the agreements work when it comes to overall drug and alcohol testing? We're going to talk about the responsibilities of the drug and alcohol program manager and designated employee representative at each organization that participates in 5311, what their responsibilities are a little bit. We're going to talk about overall your policy and what that has to entail: a training program for drug and alcohol testing for both drivers and supervisors, or safety-sensitive employees and supervisors. We're going to go over what the testing requirements are in terms of the types of tests. Again, not going to get into great detail about how they conduct the tests or individual thresholds or anything like that. We're just going to give a very big overview of what the different types of tests are. We're going to discuss oversight monitoring: who's responsible for what, when, how, why, et cetera, et cetera. Then finally, we're going to wrap up with record keeping and reporting, and then give you some resources for how you can improve your agency's drug and alcohol testing program with respect to the Section 5311 transportation program. Again, if at any point in time you have questions during this process, please feel free to enter them here in the box. If you want to send me an email with a specific question, I won't be able to get to it during this presentation, but I will address it afterwards, and I'll work with you to come to an answer or to help out. So, some background. On January 4th, 1987, just outside of Chase, Maryland, an Amtrak train with 600 passengers collided with a freight locomotive. The accident injured 174 people and killed 16 people. After the investigation, it was determined that the Conrail engineer and brakeman, who'd been smoking marijuana and basically ignored safety procedures, caused the accident. The engineer was sentenced to a 5-year prison term on a charge of manslaughter and a 3-year federal term for failing to cooperate with the investigation. A few years later, on August 29, 1991, a New York City subway accident killed 5 and injured nearly 200. Investigators of that accident determined that the operator had a 0.21 blood alcohol level when tested 13 hours after the crash. Now, for those of you who are experienced drinkers, you can imagine how much he would have had to consume in order to still have nearly a quarter of his blood alcohol, basically, consisting of alcohol, 13 hours after that crash. The investigators basically say that the operator admitted he'd been drinking all day before going to work on the night shift and passed out at the throttle. That operator was given a maximum sentence of 15 years in prison for manslaughter. Now, those two events, and there were a lot of other events in between, but those two events primarily led to the authorization and signing into law of the Omnibus Transportation Employee Testing Act in October of 1991. After a little bit of wrangling between the Senate and Senate and House and the executive branch and a handful of lawyers and attorneys and lobbyists, the program was suspended for a little while, determined who had authority when, where, and how, and then finally the final rule issued and signed into law in February of 1994. These two regulations that we talk about right here, 49 CFR Part 655 and 49 CFR Part 40, are in essence what governs or what drives the Drug and Alcohol Testing Act. Okay, so I'm being told that my slides are not progressing. Does everybody see that I'm on the background slide right now? I'm hoping. If not, then hopefully we'll. Okay, doesn't look like it's progressing here. Hang on one second, folks. Let me reset for a minute, and then we'll try and move forward. Okay, I'm not sure this is working yet or not, but let's find out. Um, are we moving now? Okay, it doesn't seem to be that we're moving. That's okay. I apologize. Technical difficulties. I'm not sure what's happening here. Um, but if you're playing along with the home game, I'm on slide number 5 at this point in time. So again, hopefully it'll start moving again at some point in time. And if not, then how's that? Now are we on the right slide? I hope so. Okay, so we're on slide 5. Let's go ahead and move forward. Okay. So in essence, what we talked about, those 2 major accidents and a handful in between there, basically signed into law in February of 1994 were 49 CFR Part 655, the prevention of alcohol misuse and prohibited drug use in transit operations, and 49 CFR Part 40, the procedures for transportation workplace drug and alcohol testing programs. In essence, this is here's what you're supposed to do, that's Part 655, and here's how you're supposed to do it, that's Part 40. Those are the two regulations that Jeff Waxman sleeps with under his pillow every single night. And that when he comes out and talks to you about your drug and alcohol program, this is exactly what he's going to talk about. These two regulations. So we're going to go into just a very little bit, again, high-level overview of what those requirements are and how they relate to your drug and alcohol program. Within those requirements and within our discussion today and Wednesday, you're going to hear a lot of acronyms that you may not necessarily be familiar with, or a lot of terms that you might not necessarily be familiar with. The first is HHS. For most of us, we already know that's Health and Human Services. The Health and Human Services Agency is kind of like the overseer overall of laboratories and testing programs in general. So this is where the Health and Human Services were the people who kind of helped create this program to begin with, and who give us our drug and alcohol education information in most instances. A service agent is somebody who is an external party who happens to be involved with the drug and alcohol testing program. Most commonly, those service agents are the collection sites themselves, the technicians at those collection sites, the laboratories who conduct the test, the medical review officers, the substance abuse professionals, and if you're part of a consortium, folks who are administering your consortium program. DAPM and DER, these are different but interchangeable acronyms or positions or titles, if you want to call it that. The DAPM just stands for Drug and Alcohol Program Manager. DER stands for Designated Employee Representative. Now, even though they sound different and they do in certain instances serve 2 different functions, it's not uncommon for a lot of operators and grant recipients to have one person serve both roles. We're going to talk a little bit about what both of those roles actually are. EBT is an evidentiary breath testing device, basically. This is the thing that you blow into. It's called a breathalyzer. The common term is called a breathalyzer. That's what you blow into to test whether or not you have any alcohol on your breath. BAT is a breath alcohol technician. That's the person who administers the breathalyzer exam or the breathalyzer test. SST is a screening test technician. This is the person at the laboratory who actually conducts the 5-panel or 6-panel screen for drugs, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. CCF is referencing a custody and control form. That's basically the form that employees have to fill out when they go for their drug and alcohol test. There is a very special way to do that, and we're not going to talk about how to do that today, but we are going to talk about it on Wednesday. The MRO is the medical review officer. That's the person who basically, after the test is completed and tested at the laboratory sends the results over to the medical review officer, and that MRO will confirm the results of that test. Whether they be negative or positive, they'll confirm them. They play a greater role in positive tests or difficulties in testing conditions or with test takers, such as shy bladder and things like that. We're not going to talk in great deal about that today, but nevertheless, the medical review officer is basically the person who confirms that the test was conducted properly, they achieve the appropriate result, and then they move forward. And then the substance abuse professional. This is something that everybody should have, just in general, as part of the Drug-Free Workplace Act and employee assistance programs and things like that. But in particular, as it relates to the drug and alcohol testing program, any employee who tests positive, whether they're terminated or not, needs to be referred to a substance abuse professional. They don't have to take advantage of that substance abuse professional's practice or services, but they have to be referred. You have that obligation. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So what is the responsibility in all of this? As the primary recipient for Section 5311 funding, IDOT has to make sure that everybody who participates in the 5311 program has to follow the program requirements for everything related to that testing program. Policy, testing, record keeping, the whole 9 yards. And we'll talk a lot about those. In essence, we have the responsibility to monitor the collection sites, the medical review officers, the laboratories who conduct the samples, or who test the samples rather, the technicians who actually administer the tests themselves, the substance abuse professionals, all of the service agents who are involved in the process. They are required to comply with the FTA drug and alcohol testing requirements. That's what they agree to when they enter into their agreement with the Federal Department of Transportation to be a qualified, certified, credentialed participant in this program. And that's part of the responsibility that we have as primary recipients, and part of the responsibility that is passed along to all of our subrecipients. So everything that we're looking at, making sure everybody's in compliance with, all of our subrecipients have the same responsibility. So too do all of our operators. Now, again, in most of our situations, the subrecipient and the operator are a partner organization in the same community, and the grant recipient, or the county, takes primary responsibility for most of that oversight for the drug and alcohol testing program. However, it's not uncommon for some of that service agent oversight to be passed along to operators as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Any non-compliance by these service operators, by these service agents, excuse me, any non-compliance by service agents on the testing program side of life can result in a public interest exclusion, which basically means that if they refuse to either adhere to the terms of their agreement with the federal DOT, or if they're conducting tests that are willfully non-compliant, they may be excluded from participating in federal programs for either a small period of time or an indefinite period of time. And most of them, by and large, are doing their job. But that is one of the punishments, or one of the potential consequences for not participating in the program in a compliant manner. The grantee responsibility from our level down to the subrecipient level, we're going to call it the grantee level at this point in time, is to oversee all of the different parts of the drug and alcohol testing program. Assignment of and responsibilities for the drug and alcohol program manager and designated employee representative. The making sure that not only does every grant recipient have a drug and alcohol testing program, but that every operator, so every agency employing a safety-sensitive position, and we'll talk about what that is here in a second, has a drug and alcohol testing policy that is compliant with the federal, or with the FTA guidelines. Every person who is every employee who is affected by this drug and alcohol process has to undergo a specific amount of training. It's varies depending on the duties of the employee, but they all have to undergo a specific level of training. They all have to be subject to drug and alcohol testing requirements, and we'll talk about what those are. And these are all the topics we're going to cover as we move forward. The subrecipients or grantees in our lexicon are responsible for oversight monitoring. That's oversight of the entire process, not just the policy, not just the training, but they have to oversee the entire process. That also includes the minutia of making sure that the employee gets to the testing center in an appropriate and adequate amount of time, not leaving them too much time, but leaving them enough time. Have to ensure that the custody control forms are filled out appropriately, et cetera, et cetera. They're also responsible for record keeping. There are certain types of records that have to be kept on site for a certain period of time, even after an employee is no longer in your employ. You have to know what that is. And then there's an annual reporting requirement that comes along with that. Subrecipients are required to report back up the food chain to us and then to a Drug and Alcohol Management Information System website all of the activity for their drug and alcohol testing program for the given year. So you have to know what those are as well. I'm going to reiterate a couple things. First, again, this is a very, very high level overview. I know we're going to throw a lot of stuff today that has significantly deeper layers associated with them, but we're not going to get too deep into those layers. We are going to get a lot deeper into those layers on Wednesday. So if you have the ability to participate on Wednesday from 10 to 4 via webinar, please plan to do so. At some point in time, Jeff and I, once this audit is concluded and we understand what our corrective action is, I'm quite certain that Jeff and I will have to sit down and come up with a slightly longer, more in-depth training program for our subrecipients that covers all of the affected areas that we're talking about today to the greatest level of detail possible. So please bear with us for the next couple of days as we kind of wade through just the general oversight responsibility. Second thing I'm going to talk about is the biggest warning in this entire program. Do not assume that vendors who you're working with as part of your drug and alcohol program are in compliance with the regulations or that they even know what those regulations are. That includes third-party administrators, consortiums, the whole 9 yards. Doesn't matter who it is that's involved in your program. Never make the assumption that that person or persons or organization knows what those regulations are and is in compliance with those regulations. For you PCOMs out there, who I hope there are quite a few of you on the call today, never assume that your operator is in compliance with the drug and alcohol testing regulations. I'm not saying that they are. I'm not saying that they aren't. I'm simply saying never make the assumption that they are. Always do the diligence in performing the oversight. Because ultimately, if something goes wrong within this testing program, the first people on the block are the agencies employing the safety-sensitive employee and then the subrecipients themselves. So make sure that you're following, that you understand what the requirements are, understand what the expectations are, and that you're conducting oversight accordingly. Excuse me. So let's talk a little bit about DAP and DER. They serve two different functions, but are oftentimes those two functions are assigned to the same person. The Drug and Alcohol Program Manager is responsible for the overall program administration and oversight. That's the person who has to make sure that all the operators and service agents are in compliance, that all of the required reports have been completed and they are accurate and they are submitted within the deadline. That's the person who basically has to make sure that the policy is up to date with all of the current regulations, if there have been any changes, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the person who primarily is going to be in contact with Jeff or myself about what those requirements are and how often they change. The designated employee representative serves a similar function, but in a slightly different capacity. In a lot of organizations, the Drug and Alcohol Program Manager is usually just that, a manager, a supervisor, somebody in a position of administrative or executive leadership. The designated employee representative, however, is usually the person who receives information. Again, these sometimes are one and the same person. The person who receives information from the testing, the consortium, we'll just use Midwest Truckers since they are our biggest consortium statewide. Midwest Truckers would communicate directly with the designated employee representative about who needs to be tested from their organization and then when that person needs to be tested, what time, what day, how long the window of testing needs to be, et cetera, et cetera. So from that perspective, the designated employee representative really does kind of prepare the random testing schedule. They receive information about who needs to be tested. They communicate directly with the random testing administrator to determine what, when, where, and how. They're probably the ones who are going to go out and actually accompany the employee to the testing site or facility. They're the ones that are going to receive the forms that have been filled out after the test has been conducted, et cetera, et cetera. And then once the test results have been completed and concluded, that person, the designated employee representative, is more than likely also going to be the person who receives the official test results. Again, in a good majority of the instances for our world, the world of Illinois, the DAPM and the DER are often the same person. You'll also have an instance where you'll have a primary and a secondary, a backup for that person, so that when the primary DAPM or DER is out of the office on vacation, whatever, there's a secondary person that's also notified at the same time, so that at least somebody can take care of making sure that the random testing schedules are taking place. This is also the person, I don't know how it didn't make it to this slide, but this is also the person who might go out and conduct the post-accident investigation to determine if a drug test needs to be concluded, things like that. So again, oftentimes the same person, but they serve two similar but distinctly different roles. The policy, again, usually part of the drug and alcohol program manager's responsibilities, required for anybody who employs a safety-sensitive position. We're going to talk here in just a second about what that is. The policy needs to take one or the other path. You can either be a zero-tolerance organization where you say, hey, if you're going to test positive for drugs or alcohol, you're not going to work here. Or you can have a second chance option, which is if you test positive for drug and alcohol, here are a series of steps that you're going to have to go through in order to return to duty. Those steps are not, they're not arbitrary. They are not something that you have discretion over. In order for your employee to return to duty, if you choose that option, the FTA is going to dictate exactly what steps that employee and that organization has to go through before that employee can return to duty. It cannot be decided on a case-by-case basis, so you have to decide one path or the other. There's no wiggle room in that. You can have agency-specific criteria for what an employee would have to do or how often an employee is going to be tested or things of that nature, but those agency-specific requirements cannot conflict with what the FTA requirements are. For example, the FTA requires that on any given month you have to test, or excuse me, on any given period you have to test no less than 25% of your safety-sensitive employees for drug use. You can say we're going to test 50% of our employees. You have that ability to say that within your policy. You have to identify that yes, we're going to test 50%. But the FTA drug and alcohol requirements are only 25%. So again, you can have your own criteria in there, but so long as it's identified as your own criteria and that the FTA criteria is specifically and explicitly spelled out, and that those two do not necessarily conflict. One of the biggest issues that we have in terms of compliance with drug and alcohol policies, and this isn't just statewide, it's nationwide, there are a lot of sample policies floating around out there. And the reason for that is, again, this is a very prescribed testing program, a very prescribed oversight requirements from the FDA. So most of these drug and alcohol testing policies pretty much say the same thing. However, laced throughout are situations or forks in the policy road where the sponsor agency has to make a decision. We're either going to be zero tolerance or we're going to be second chance. And if we're zero tolerance, we have to take this path and go through these steps. And if we're second chance, we have to take this path and go through these steps. Far too many agencies simply drop their name into a policy template, sign off on it, and move forward, not realizing that they actually have both zero tolerance and second chance language in that policy. So whenever Jeff or Candy went from Midwest Truckers gives you, or Lindsay Whitson from Bi-State, I know they're a consortium as well. Whenever one of these folks gives you a sample policy, read the policy, not just the cover page. Read the whole policy, make the appropriate decisions, and understand exactly what the policy requires. Second thing I didn't put in this slide, I apologize, was every employee has to receive a copy of the drug and alcohol policy, and they have to sign an acknowledgement form that they have read it, that they have acknowledged that they've received it, and that they agree to the terms contained within that policy. And that's a separate takeaway page. They sign it, you stow it away in a record somewhere for them. So make sure that happens as well. Everybody has to go through training. All of the safety-sensitive employees and supervisors have to go through training. For drivers, for safety-sensitive employees in general, it's a required 1-hour training. I say drivers here because that's the largest pool of safety-sensitive folks. For supervisors, it is a 2-hour required training. And that teaches them not just the basic requirements of the testing program like they would get for the normal driver training, but also for reasonable suspicion determination training. That reasonable suspicion training really should be attended by anybody who observes a safety-sensitive employee on a regular basis. Doesn't do a whole lot of good for a supervisor in one city to go through reasonable suspicion training if the bus drivers 45 minutes away in a satellite bus barn don't have a supervisor. Somebody has to be able to witness the safety-sensitive employee activities and interact with them on a regular basis to determine whether or not they are fit for duty every day. So that's who's going to have to go through that. And then within all of this, you have to keep logs of when and what training classes were conducted, who attended those classes, how often, how frequently, et cetera, et cetera. We often counsel folks that there should be a master log. And a master log is it's basically a training program log that says on October 3rd of 2015, we conducted this training class, and here's who attended. And then I should be able to dive into an employee's record and see that John Doe, driver number 2, attended this training on October 15th and that training on September 3rd and this training on April 4th. And I should be able to see every single training program that person, that employee attended. So make sure you understand the difference between the two. There's your training program log and there's your employee training log. So who is subject to testing? We keep talking about these safety-sensitive employees. Who is subject to this testing program? A safety-sensitive employee is classified as any employee who operates a revenue service vehicle, whether in revenue service or not, doesn't matter, whether they're backing it out of the parking garage or whether they are carrying a full busload full of people, doesn't matter. Anybody who operates a revenue service vehicle. Includes the mechanic, it includes the kid who washes the buses in the summertime, everybody, doesn't matter who it is. Anybody who operates a non-revenue service vehicle where a commercial driver's license is required, also required to be subject to testing, also will be labeled as safety sensitive. Anybody who controls the dispatch or movement of a revenue service vehicle. Now, in a lot of instances, our services are demand response in nature, and what will happen is your dispatcher will just say, hey, Shirley Jones needs picked up at 2 o'clock and here's her address. And the driver is responsible for getting the vehicle from wherever he or she is out to Shirley Jones's house. That can be conveyed as controlling dispatch, but also maybe perhaps not. This, I think, was intended more for dispatchers in a fixed route environment or in a deviated fixed route environment or deviated route environment. But nevertheless, anybody who controls the dispatcher movement of the vehicle needs to be subjected and classified as a safety-sensitive employee. Anybody who performs maintenance on a vehicle or any equipment, for that matter, that's used in revenue service. You have a garage and you have a guy who does all of your vehicle maintenance and another guy who comes in and does all of your lift maintenance. Well, your lift maintenance guy is just as important in the safety-sensitive qualification as is your guy who does the engine maintenance. So both of those folks would be classified as safety-sensitive. And then anybody who, pardon my spelling mistake there, anybody who carries a firearm, not a firearm, anybody who carries a firearm for security purposes in a transit environment will definitely be classified as a safety-sensitive employee. We don't have a lot of, I don't think we have any, in fact, in our 5311 program, armed security personnel on transit vehicles, so we don't have to worry about those folks. But everybody else on this list we definitely have. So when you're developing your job descriptions, when you're building your employee base for random testing requirements, these are the 4 functions, primary, 5 total, but the 4 primary functions in our world that you have to look at to determine whether or not a person is safety sensitive or not. Now, I'm a big fan of, especially when we talk about dispatchers and supervisors and things like that, if there's a chance that somebody's going to operate a revenue service vehicle, absolutely throw them in there. Even if they don't drive on a daily basis, if there's a chance they will, throw them in there. If there's a chance that they could be controlling the movement of that vehicle through specific or explicit instructions, then definitely throw them in there. As long as the cost isn't so great that it becomes a burden, I would definitely say go ahead and throw them in there. The question came, how often should you do training for drivers? Every 3 years. Drug and alcohol training should be conducted no less than every 3 years for drivers and and supervisors. So I would do the, and this is just training in general. It's not just drug and alcohol training, but it's training in general. Always do refresher training every 3 years. You can cycle them, you can stagger them, doesn't matter. But always do the drug and alcohol training and reasonable suspicion training every 3 years. Okay. So I'm an employer of a safety-sensitive person. What are my requirements? So you are responsible for the actions of the officials, representatives, and service agents involved in the program, just like we talked about. You have to make sure that you are utilizing qualified, credentialed, DOT-credentialed, safety-sensitive, service agents, right? Drug and alcohol testing service agents. All the agreements between the employers and the service agents are a matter of law and require compliance. So it's your responsibility to enforce those compliance areas. They must provide documentation of the credentials. They can't just tell you that they've been through DOT training. They can't just tell you that they're DOT certified. They have to be able to provide documentation. It's your responsibility to collect and store that documentation appropriately. Good faith effort is never a defense for noncompliance. It's not just in drug and alcohol world. That's everywhere. A good faith effort is never a defense for noncompliance. In this case in particular, we all know what the regulations are. We all know where the regulations are. We all know how to find them. And most importantly, we all know who to talk to if we are unsure about what we're supposed to be doing. And then you as an employer are responsible for obtaining test results and other information as required for compliance purposes. That's your job. That's your responsibility in administering this program in general and employing and agreeing to employ safety-sensitive employer or safety-sensitive positions. So it may sound cumbersome and overwhelming at times, but it's actually a pretty easy paint-by-numbers process when you get right down to it. As a safety-sensitive employee, what am I responsible for? What are the expectations for me as an employee? Well, first and foremost, I think above all else, don't use or possess any illicit drugs. Just don't do it. You shouldn't be doing it anyway, but just don't do it. Don't report for duty or remain on duty if you're under the influence or impaired by any alcohol. Don't use alcohol within 4 hours of reporting for duty or while you're on call. Don't consume alcohol within 8 hours of an accident in which you were involved. I'm shaken up a little bit by hitting the back of that car in front of me, and Mrs. Johnson fell to her knees and scraped her knee up, but I can't go have a drink to wash away my guilt until after post-accident testing has been completed. And then I have to submit. I'm going to sign and certify to this when I sign my drug and alcohol policy form that all U.S. DOT tests I'm going to participate in. And then I acknowledge that if I refuse to submit to a test, that pretty much is the same as a positive test result. And then I'm going to be subject to any consequences therein that would be outlined in the policy for a positive test result. It's pretty simple stuff. Again, not complicated, not rocket science, and definitely doesn't require a great deal of effort. So what types of tests are our safety-sensitive employees going to be subject to? Pre-employment testing. That's number one, right out of the gate. I want to hire Maggie Smith to drive my buses. I got to put her through a pre-employment test. I cannot let her perform that safety-sensitive function until after she has successfully passed. Or in this instance, I'm using the term pass to mean negative test result, until a negative test result has been returned to me from her pre-employment testing. A lot of folks want to hire drivers, bring them on board, then within the first 90 days, send them to drug and alcohol training, and then send them for pre-employment testing. No, you can't do that. You can't even really hire the driver for the safety-sensitive function. We shouldn't. You can, but you shouldn't. But you definitely cannot let them perform the safety-sensitive function until after they have successfully completed the drug and alcohol pre-employment test. Random testing. Potential for testing has to be there for all operating hours. So if you operate service at 11 o'clock at night, your drivers have to know they could be tested when they come off of their shift at 11 o'clock at night. And you have the responsibility to occasionally test drivers who are coming off a shift at 11 o'clock at night. That's your responsibility. You have to test 25% for prohibited drug use and 10% for alcohol use every quarter. Got to do that. If you're part of a consortium, the consortium that you're a part of, the random testing pool that you're a part of, has to test that entire pool at 25% for drugs and 10% for alcohol during the required testing period. We're also subject to post-accident testing requirements. These are specific thresholds or specific conditions under which we're going to test after an accident. If an accident results in a fatality, if there were any injuries that required immediate medical attention away from the scene of the accident, or if the accident results in one or more vehicles, either my revenue vehicle or another vehicle, incurring any disabling damage that requires towing away from the site. In those instances, we're going to require a drug and alcohol test. And then there are certain time limits within which you have to conduct the test, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on Wednesday. But that's post-accident testing. Reasonable suspicion testing. A trained supervisor of safety-sensitive employees has to observe articulable, specific, contemporaneous physical behavior. There shouldn't be a comma there. Physical, behavioral, or performance indicators of probable drug and or alcohol use. What does all that mean? That means if I see John Smith wobbling on his way to his bus and I go talk to him and I can smell alcohol on his breath, I have reason to believe he's under the influence of something. I can require that he go for a reasonable suspicion drug test, and he has to do it. He doesn't have a choice. And then return to duty testing. Return to duty testing, like we talked about, is for return to duty and follow-up testing. Not every safety-sensitive employee may be subject to that. The safety-sensitive, the drug and alcohol testing policy is going to determine whether you have zero tolerance or second chance. If you're a second chance policy, then return to duty testing and follow-up testing will be required. Return to duty testing has to follow evaluation and treatment from a qualified substance abuse professional, and then the follow-up testing has to be identified and prescribed by that qualified substance abuse professional. Again, those are only if you have second chance testing. So not everybody's going to be subjected to those, but if you are, that's what you need to know. Oversight monitoring. All program facets are the responsibility of the grant subrecipients. This is just not open to negotiation or interpretation. If you accept 5311 funding, you're going to be responsible for everything. Policy amendments, regulatory changes, testing requirements, everything that we're talking about right here. And you're going to have to monitor. Crap. Hang on one second, folks. I apologize. I have to pause this. I'll be right back. Sorry about that. Having some technical difficulties here. Okay, oversight monitoring. As a 5311 recipient, you are responsible for all program facets. Anytime the regulations change and your policy has to be amended, you need to be on top of that. Jeff's pretty good about letting everybody know when something has changed, and then making sure that those changes trickle down to operators and recipients alike. But again, you have to make sure that your policy reflects whatever changes are required there. All the testing requirements that we talked about earlier and are going to talk about in greater detail later on, you're responsible for making sure that all of those requirements are followed as prescribed. You're responsible for the oversight of all the documents, distributing them talking about them, collecting them, the whole 9 yards. And then refresher training every 3 years, making sure that your folks go through drug and alcohol training as required, either the hour-long class or the 2-hour-long class, whichever one. You're also responsible for oversight of all of the service agents. You as a recipient need to understand what happens at the collection sites. How are they conducting the tests? How are they conducting collections? How are the laboratories conducting the tests? Are all of these folks properly credentialed through the federal DOT? Are their credentials up to date? All of that stuff. And then, as subrecipients, PCOMs in particular, or grant counties in particular here, you also have to make sure that your providers are following the requirements as they need to, because these safety-sensitive employees are not always employed by the county. They're usually employed by a not-for-profit agency that you've passed the funding along to. So you have to make sure that agency is following the appropriate procedures when it comes to testing records and testing procedures in general and policies and all that stuff. So that can be kind of complicated. But again, this is a pretty prescribed paint-by-numbers program. So it should be a little easier to get a handle on and definitely open to less interpretation. Oops, sorry. Here we go. Okay. Record keeping. Record keeping is simple yet not so simple. As with all things, there is a record retention policy for the drug and alcohol testing program records. Jeff Waxman will be glad to give you that. If you don't already have a copy of it, we'll probably provide it during the training on Wednesday. But it's important to understand what records have to be kept and for how long they have to be kept, and who has to keep them and who has to have access to them. One of the very important things a lot of folks overlook in this is the drug and alcohol testing records have to be kept in a locked, secure location, so a locked file cabinet that only the drug and alcohol program manager has access to. That's important stuff, because test results are going to come back, and that's confidential information, and we don't want that information to be accessible by just anybody. So make sure you understand that. Everybody who reviews the policy has to sign a policy receipt and acknowledgement form. You have to keep a copy of that form for as long as that person's on hand, or as long as that person's employed. Excuse me. Training documents. We talked about the training and what's required there, and you'll need to be able to document to the auditors, to myself, to Jeff, anybody who comes out and does a review, that yes, in fact, all of our employees have gone through this training, and here's our records to indicate that. Random testing notifications, the testing forms themselves, the custody and control form, all of that stuff has to be kept on file in every employee record, and the same thing with the test results. And again, that has to be kept under lock and key. All of the drug and alcohol testing records have to be kept under lock and key. One of the things that we don't talk about in this record keeping thing that we will talk about in much greater detail on Wednesday is I'm going to back up the slides here for a second, and I'm going to talk about this particular slide right here, or this particular section right here. In fact, let me just highlight that for everybody so we know exactly what we're talking about. This right here. If I had to point to what the single biggest compliance deficiency is with the drug and alcohol testing programs, if I had to talk about what the biggest inconsistency is with the drug and alcohol testing programs, not just within the state of Illinois, but nationwide, this is one of them. There's several, but this is probably the biggest one, is that random testing is not truly random. Drivers, I should say drivers, it's not a fair statement. Folks who are prone to drug use are pretty savvy folks, and they figure out ways that they can use those drugs and drink that alcohol when they're not supposed to. And so they will pick up very quickly on any kind of a pattern that emerges when it comes to drug tests. And even for those of us that don't use drugs on a regular basis, or at all, period, for that matter, we pick up on it too. It's not difficult to tell these patterns, and employees talk to one another. So when you schedule your drug tests in a very predictable fashion, it really does defeat the deterrent effect in the first place. We're going to talk about this. We're going to hammer this point home. The potential for testing has to be there during all hours of operation. That includes before and after an employee's shift. It includes right smack in the middle of an employee's shift. It's Mondays, Tuesdays, Fridays, Wednesdays, Saturdays, Sundays. It doesn't matter. If you operate service, your safety-sensitive employees have to be under the impression that it is reasonable for them to be tested at any point in time during the service operation. It is your responsibility as a grant recipient and a drug and alcohol program administrator or manager to make that happen, to make sure that not only do they understand that, but that those tests are actually occurring at all hours of operation. If you operate service at 11 o'clock on Sunday night, you have to have the capacity to be able to test your employees at 11 o'clock on Sunday night. Not all of them, obviously, but the employees that are on duty at 11 o'clock on Sunday night, they have to have just as potential a possibility for testing as do the employees that are working at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday. They all have to have the same potential. So your responsibility is going to be go out there and find service agents. Find out where my service agents are here. Go out there and find service agents who, doesn't matter. Go out and find service agents who are doing exactly that. Who are going to work with me to have services for collection and testing, well, I mean not testing, but definitely collection, available at all hours of my operation. I need to know as a drug and alcohol program manager that I can call this clinic or this hospital or this doctor's office who is DOT certified, and they will conduct the drug urine specimen collection and breath alcohol test for me at all hours of my operation. That's your responsibility. That's not Jeff's responsibility. You know, Jeff's going to go out, he's going to do his part. Jeff and Candy are going to do their part, and they're going to go out and routinely interview all of these service agents. They're going to talk to the collection site, the MROs, the laboratories, et cetera. They're going to ask them a ton of questions about how they do what it is that they're supposed to do, how they achieve their credentials. They're going to get copies of their credentials, the whole 9 yards. Jeff's going to do a lot of that on your behalf and in concert with you. Still your responsibility to ensure that. But your bigger responsibility in that picture is to make sure that those service agents are available to do the collection for you at all hours of operation. There's no excuse that's going to be acceptable to an auditor or anybody else if you operate service at a time that your service agent is not able to make a collection. Okay, so make sure that you understand that's very, very important. The second, probably the second or tied for first biggest issue that I see is not necessarily the random testing, is not necessarily the random testing issue, but it is the use of the custody and control form. And I think at some point in time, probably after the audit, we're going to go over in great detail what all of the different components of the custody and control form are and what you as a program manager, as a designated employee representative, need to look for when reviewing the custody and control form to ensure that it's been completed correctly. Employees themselves complete them incorrectly, laboratories complete them incorrectly, specimen collectors complete them incorrectly. It's just, this is a pretty widespread issue that leads to a lot of deficiencies for simple, often overlooked errors. So we'll go over in significant detail at a later training date exactly what that CCF looks like and what needs to be included on there for it to be a compliant process. The final part in this is the annual reporting. I know we here at IDOT love to inundate grant recipients with various forms that we ask them to fill out, asking for 1,001 different data points of information that it seems like we don't ever use. We do. We use it all, just at different levels. This one, however, not really required by us. This is required by the FTA, much like NTD reporting. It's just an annual report that everybody's got to fill out, whether we like it or not. And it needs to include accurate information on your drug and alcohol testing program. This is the website address to where you would go to submit your MIS report. You'll work directly with Jeff Waxman on the information itself. He'll review it, and work with you on how to submit it, when to submit it, whatever corrections need to be made, et cetera, et cetera. For those who don't know, Jeff is our drug and alcohol program manager for DIPIT. This is exactly what he does. This is his area of expertise. He's very good at it, and we trust him entirely to make sure that everybody is compliant and work with them to bring them up to speed if they're not. That's Jeff's number there. Myself, I'm not anywhere near as versed in this process as Jeff is, but I got my start in this industry doing exactly that, drug and alcohol compliance reviews for all kinds of different states throughout the country. And so I still have quite a bit of that knowledge and still know exactly where to find all the answers to the questions that I can't come up with right off the top of my head. Which leads me to the websites. These are the resources that I would go to if I had questions. The FTA website, obviously, is always going to be the first and foremost leader in terms of resources and information. After that, National RTAP has a pretty good resource library when it comes to the drug and alcohol program. RLS and Associates Incorporated, they are the leading experts in the country for the drug and alcohol program. For those of you who may receive I believe it's a quarterly, it might be a monthly drug and alcohol newsletter. That newsletter is actually written and edited by Robbie Sarles of RLS and Associates. She's been very instrumental in developing policy and interpreting policy and developing requirements and best practice tools and things like that for the program on a national level. So they're always a wonderful resource for any information that you may be seeking. Again, they're a private consulting firm, so the information may not necessarily be free, but at a minimum, they are definitely a resource to help. And then the Center for Urban Transportation Research out at the University of South Florida, they are probably second in line to RLS in terms of their drug and alcohol acumen. So they have a lot of good resources for implementation of the program. The rules for drug and alcohol testing on 5307 are no different than they are in 5311. This is across the board, so there's definitely no change there. So they're still a very viable resource for your rural program as much as they're an urban program. As always, take advantage of the resources. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to reach out to Jeff. I would recommend Jeff first before you reach out to me. But nevertheless, Jeff and I oftentimes talk and come up with a good consensus answer before we shoot it out to the field. The RTAC staff, Ed Heflin, Mabel, Jackie, Carol, they're all great resources for questions. If they don't know the answers, they usually know to come to myself or Jeff if they need to. And then, of course, HSTP coordinators, always a good technical assistance resource for any 5311 program question, but they always definitely reach out to Jeff and myself if they are confronted with the drug and alcohol question that anybody might have. So feel free to use the resources, reach out. And I apologize I didn't put a slide together for this part, but the training on Wednesday, what we're going to do on Wednesdays, we're going to go over the actual questions that the program auditors are going to ask the drug and alcohol program managers when they go conduct their site visits. Just a quick little background for what the audit is going to look like. The FTA team is going to come in and talk to us on Monday, July 20th. They're going to come in and talk to us in the morning. They're going to let us know exactly how everything is going to go. And then they're going to splinter off into 3 separate review teams, and they're going to go visit a grand total of 9 subrecipients over the course of the next 3 days. So 3 reviews will be taking place concurrently throughout the state. I'll be at one, Jeff will be at one, and then probably John Morella will be at the other one. And then your DIPIT project manager will be there. Russ Flincham, Saul Rivas, Melanie Turner, they'll also be present. We'll also have a member from the FTA there. So an FTA program manager will be on hand at each one of these reviews. You can pick their brain directly about the stuff that we are always telling you. And then, of course, the actual auditors themselves are going to be wonderful resources. The interview itself is probably a 6-hour process for just the drug and alcohol program managers, depending on how quickly they can get through the questions and how resourceful the program managers are in answering the questions. So what we're going to do next Wednesday is we're going to go over each one of those questions. We're going to give you some information about what it is that they expect. And again, we're going to do this live and in person for the affected, audited sites. Everybody else is welcome to come in and view it on the webinar. We're taking the questions directly from the FDA website. That site right there, transit-safety@volpe.gov, that's where we get the questions. Buried within a couple of layers of pages there are the DAPM questions, the service agent questions for the collection site, the breath and alcohol technician, the laboratory, the MRO, the SAP. Everybody involved in the program has their own specific set of interview questions. And the FDA is kind enough to put them right out there on the internet so nobody is surprised by what an auditor is going to ask. We'll provide everybody with copies of those questions on site at the training. But again, for those who are dialing in from a webinar, please feel free to go out to that FDA website and download those questions and familiarize yourself with them and try to get an understanding of what the auditors are looking for. Most importantly, however, is those are the questions that you should use when you're conducting your oversight of these service agents. Download those questions, read them, understand the connection to the regulations, and then when you go out and talk with your service agents, MROs, SAPs, whomever you're going to talk to, ask them those questions the same as an auditor would. They're no different. RLS and Associates, when they do their drug and alcohol compliance audits throughout the country, that's the questions they use. They didn't create their own. The auditors themselves, the third-party private consulting firm auditors that the FDA hired, they're going to use those questions. So we're all talking the same language. We all get confronted with the same questions and information. We're all asked to produce at the same level. So that, again, nobody's going to be caught off guard by what's available out there. Definitely go out there and look for that. That being said, I think that we are done for this particular broadcast. Again, I want to thank everybody for their time. I apologize for the technical difficulties. I have no idea what happened with my computer, but it seems to be working fine now. I did record this webinar, so I will post this to the YouTube channel just as soon as I possibly can. And then I will also put together another survey at the SurveyMonkey website asking everybody to get their opinions out to me. I don't take any offense to any opinion. Some of them have been pretty harsh, and I appreciate that. It helps me hone my presentation skills. There was one question that got asked that I wanted to answer. It says that the agency policy is broader than the post-accident testing. The policies for any accident, incident, or workplace injury, any employee, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is that okay? The answer is yes. You can have within your drug and alcohol policy criteria that are more restrictive than what the FDA calls for. There are two things to keep in mind. The first is make sure that the policies are not less restrictive, meaning that make sure that your policy doesn't contradict something that the FDA says. If the FDA says that you're only going to test somebody in the instance of an accident when there's been an injury or death or the vehicle rendered immobile, but you say we don't care if there was an injury, we don't care if there's a death, we don't care if there was an injury or the vehicle is immobile, we're going to test them anyway. Make sure that your policy identifies that here's the FDA standard, here is the transit agency standard, and we're going to test under these conditions. We're going to conduct an FDA test under these conditions, or we're going to conduct an agency test under these conditions. The second thing is when you are putting in your own policies and your own thresholds, you cannot use the federal DOT test. You can conduct your own drug test if you want, but you are not allowed to use the federal DOT drug testing form, the custody control form. Not allowed to use that. You have to use basically a generic one. So make sure that if you're conducting those tests on your own, that you're using the laboratories and all that stuff are using the right forms and they're conducting the appropriate test. Okay. The second question was, can the DAPM or the DER be in the safety-sensitive drug pool? The answer is yes. However, make sure that the administrator of your random testing pool understands that your primary DER is also in the pool, so that if that person's name gets chosen for a random test, that an alternate contact or an alternate DER is notified that this person needs to be tested. So just using as the example, and I'm just gonna pick on whoever I feel like picking on. Out in Lee County, we have Jamie Blatty. She's the executive director for LOTS. If Jamie's going to be in the random testing pool, and she's also the person who receives all of the random test notifications, then Midwest Truckers needs to know when Jamie's name gets pulled to be tested, we have to contact Beth Nickel or whatever. I can't remember Beth's last name. Doesn't matter. We have to contact whomever Jamie's backup is, whoever that secondary DAPM or DER is. So yes, you can absolutely have that person in the pool. Just make sure that there is an appropriate secondary and that the consortium or the third-party administrator knows who to send that alternate notification to. Same thing with the test results. Jamie's test results cannot go to Jamie. They got to go to that other person. And make sure that that other person is, again, you don't want to send it to a dispatcher. You don't want to send it to a driver. You want to send it to a person in a position of somewhat of authority. So that'll be something that DAPM, DER are going to have to work out ahead of time. Who's primary, who's secondary, and who do we contact if one of us gets pulled, et cetera, et cetera. In a lot of instances, folks like Jamie don't drive very often. They don't dispatch very often. They're doing executive and administrative stuff, and they don't need to be in the safety-sensitive pool in the first place. But if you're a smaller agency and you're pulling a lot of double and triple and quadruple duty, that may be something that you have to do. So absolutely, you can facilitate that. Okay. As always, if you guys have any more targeted questions that you want answers to, please feel free to email me or Jeff. We'll be glad to kick them around and come up with a good answer for you or direct you to the right place. Again, I'll send out the information on the video upload and the SurveyMonkey, and then hopefully we'll hear from most of you and see most of you next Wednesday. Once again, 10 o'clock, Wednesday, June 24th. Should last 3 or 4 hours. Please plan on 10 to 4 at the absolute latest. But we'll be doing, hopefully, technical glitches aside, we'll be doing another webinar for that event as well. So thank you everybody for your time today, and have a wonderful weekend.